Now we are getting ready to work on the trim pieces for the Draketail. Let's turn this around so you can see better, and we'll pull our deck out. We had the deck in place to while we were laying the clear coating on the inside set up, and now we can remove the deck. And all this is set up now nicely. Take our weights out. And the weights did have packaging tape on them, so they didn't get glued in. And that all looks really nice in there. The clear coat always takes a lot longer to set up. It's even overnight, it's not totally set up yet. It's still a little sticky. It's not going to come off of my fingers, but it still has a little stickiness to it. Okay, and just a quick note, this is the 3M professional 3M paper that I was talking about. You can see the purple color. You can see the label if I get my fingers out of it. Comes in a pack like this. You maybe will get smaller packs, but it's really nice stuff, so it's worth getting more of it like that. This is the 120 grit, and you need at least 80 grit paper, 120 grit, and 220. But with sandpaper, you do less work if you have all the grits in between. So you could go 80, 100, 120. Then it goes up to 150, then 180, and then 220. You could even go one finer than 220 if you wanted to, although you don't really need finer than 220 necessarily. Okay, so you'll love this paper. Purple. It's purple, and it's made by 3M, and it's called Pro Grade Precision. And available online or at Sherwin-Williams stores. And then this is nice paper as well. This white paper is the 220 grit. This is a silicone carbide paper. Very sharp, stays sharp a long time, works really well for everything. Okay, now on the Draketail, we are getting to the point where we're ready to start thinking about the trim pieces that wrap around the top of the drake whale. And then those trim pieces continue into a long trim piece that goes the whole length of the side, right up against the top edge of the side. Those trim pieces can be called the out whale, maybe in a large size boat, the out whale. Trim piece along the top of the gunwale. Always sand with the grain. So on the Draketail you're sanding up and down. On the sides you're sanding forwards and back. Get your merge between the Draketail ply and the side ply as smooth as possible at this point, and run your finger over it, and that will tell you if it's really smooth or not. You can feel a variation of a thousandth of an inch with your finger. It's amazing the precision. You can feel things that you can't see. I mean, it looks perfectly flat, but I can feel just the very slightest, maybe about a thousandth of an inch ridge. Right, and just a teensy bit right there now. And that took care of it. Nice. The other side looks good. Okay, now the Draketail outwhale pieces are these little mahogany pieces here. I don't know if you can see them very well. And there are two sets. And you don't want to mix up those sets. The first set has a shorter, actually the first set, the set we'll put on first, has a longer middle curved piece there, like so, and slightly shorter edge pieces. And the piece we'll put on top, you could do it either order, but this piece will go on easier, so I think we'll do it on the top because that's the part you'll see. It has a shorter middle curved piece, You see, compared to the longer middle curved piece, so a shorter middle curved piece and then longer outside curves. Now you'll want to clean these up with sandpaper, but be gentle with them because these are delicate parts. So sand the tabs off and sand the fuzz off. You'll do better with sanding block. Here's my block here. Because otherwise you'll sand on either side of the tab without sanding the tab off. So use your sanding block on this and just be very delicate. If you did break a corner off one of the pieces, use that set of pieces first and underneath and glue that corner back in place. Okay, now we can sand the tabs off. Glue the broken piece back in place, and then put the 3 pieces that are intact on as a second layer. So you could switch the order that you're doing this in, although overall I think it's easier to put the short middle piece on the top surface. So the second, start with the longer middle piece, because that piece is going to be a little bit harder to shape and wrap around. Now if we start to try to bend these into place, there's a pretty darn good chance we'll just snap them. So at this point, after we get these sanded nicely and smoothly, then we're going to adjourn to the kitchen, and we're going to steam these pieces. So that'll be kind of a fun little diversion there. Okay, so make sure you get all the fuzz off. But at this point, and don't change the shape dramatically of these. Don't use power sanding equipment on this, I don't think, because it's such a light sanding job, and you're likely to change the shape of these pieces. Oh, one more note that's really quite important. There are 2 sets of these pieces. One has a longer middle curved piece than the other set. Let's see if you can see that. And here's the shorter one, longer one, and shorter one below it. If you can see those. And then the end pieces with the longer center piece, of course, you need the longer end pieces. Now, these end pieces are a little hard to tell, especially on the shorter end pieces. That's not exactly an even curve. You can tell more easily on the set of pieces with the shorter middle piece where they have longer end pieces. That one needs a little more sanding, actually. Tabs still showing on that. These have to be sanded nicely now because they're hard to, you're not going to be able to sand them once they're glued on in place. So sand them nicely now. That's your final thing. Now, with the longer ones, it's a little easier to tell that it's not exactly an even curve. You're not going to be able to see that really very easily, but this end of the curve is decidedly a more curved than this part where it straightens out there. Now, if you want to see that, and the more curved part is going to go towards the center line to meet the very curved middle piece. And if you put that on backwards, it's not going to fit very well. If you can't quite see that curve being different, trace it on your paper, on a flat piece of paper, and trace the ends. And then when you flip it the other way and line it up, you'll see that one end is decidedly more curved. It won't line up anymore, and that'll tell you which end is more curved. On these longer pieces, it's a lot easier to tell. On the shorter pieces, the tracing will reveal which end is slightly more curved, but there's not nearly as much difference on these shorter pieces. So tracing is a pretty good idea on these shorter pieces, because otherwise there's a good chance you might get them on the wrong way, and it won't work quite as well. On the shorter piece, not as big a difference though. Okay, and this is the more curved end there. Okay, So when we put these on, they're going to go like that, and the more curved end against the middle piece, and the more curved end against the middle piece, like so. We would like to use the longer middle piece first, and then the shorter middle piece on top. There are 2 layers. That's why there are 6 pieces, 2 sets of pieces, 2 layers that will go on. Now, if you take this piece and try to bend it on now, there's a pretty good chance it's going to break. It won't take that sharp a bend. So now don't try that because it'll break. If you break one piece, use that piece and that set of pieces on the first layer and glue it back together in place. But try not to break any of the pieces. It's just takes more work if you break the piece. And then use the unbroken pieces as the second layer on top. But to get these to bend, we're going to now go up to the kitchen, and we're going to boil these pieces. Most people have heard of steaming wood to make it more flexible, to help it bend around tight bends. Well, boiling wood is actually as effective, or possibly even more effective, than steaming wood. And the reason one would suspect that we don't hear about boiling wood to bend it more is in full-size boat construction. If you have a 20-foot long piece of wood that you're trying to put a bend into, it's hard to boil a 20-foot long piece of wood. It's much easier to steam it. But boiling works very quickly and very effectively. If you boil it for about 5 minutes, you'll find that it is all of a sudden quite flexible. And in fact, that's probably how the concept began. Somebody probably put a stirring stick in a pot of stew or boiling water or something, and took it out and said, "Oh, look at this! It's really floppy. Isn't that something?" So the heating and the moisture tends to relax the lignin, that is one of the things that holds the wood stiff, and then it is free to change its shape, and when it cools, it will hold that new shape. So we will go up to the kitchen and boil these and fit them. Now, wood will, when you bend it with heat and steam or boiling, moisture and heat, it'll take a bend, and then it'll cool in that bend, but it will relax very slightly, trying to return to its flat state. So we'll bend our pieces around a radius that is slightly tighter than the radius of our Draketail. If we just bend them right in place on here, they'll tend to spring back a little bit as they cool and after they've cooled and dried. So we'll bend them on a slightly tighter radius after boiling them, and then when we bring them down to put them on the Draketail, they should fit pretty precisely. Okay, now to the kitchen. Okay, here we have our pieces laid out correctly with the centerpiece and then the more curved end of each of the side pieces going in towards the centerpiece, and then right beside it we have our bending jig, and this has a taper to it. This mug has a taper to it that worked out just right. The top wider part of the mouth of the mug is 4 inches wide, and the narrower bottom part is 2.5 inches wide. Anything roughly in that size range should work fine. And over here we have our water boiling away, and we're going to start. You might as well not, in for a penny, in for a pound may not be the best approach here. So you might as well start with just one piece. Throw that in, set your timer for 5 minutes. and let it cook. Maybe have a cup of tea for the while that's boiling away. Don't boil all your water out. I have about at least an inch of water in there. Don't boil all your water away, or else your piece of wood will get scorched and burned up. So we'll let that boil. We'll give it 5 minutes. After the first one, we might boil a couple at a time, so it'll go a little bit quicker. But give yourself a chance with initially with just one, so you can experiment with that one without having quite as much at stake. But you shouldn't have any trouble with it. And there we are. At our 5 minutes is up. And here's our pot. We're going to swing over to our work surface here. And there's our molding jig. And bring our pan over. Now, this thin piece of wood will cool off almost instantly. So I have the pan right beside our molding jig. And let's get this figured out. It's still stay pretty warm in there. It's not boiling anymore, obviously. And you need an implement to fish that out. You don't want to stick your fingers in there. Now the Draketail has a narrower radius at the top of the Draketail on the deck side, and gets a wider radius as it goes down. So we're going to wrap this with the curve towards the top, the inside of the curve, the concave side of the curve towards the top, just like on the Draketail. Okay, fish it out and instantly wrap it around there tightly. Press it against, so this middle part is tight against. If you just bend the ends in without pressing it against, you might not be successful. It might bend and break right in the middle, too sharp a bend. So as you wrap it around, make sure you're pushing in on the middle right against your form. And already it's quite cool because my form is quite cool. If you might actually not do badly to put your form, your mug obviously, into the refrigerator before you start this process and bring it out, because I'm actually working in a fairly cool space. It's probably, I don't know, it must be 50 degrees in here, but it's not much warmer than 50 degrees. Okay, and now that's totally cool against the cold surface of the ceramic, and I'm going to let it go and we'll see what happens. And look, there we have, see how it did relax quite a bit from when I had it tight against there, and it'll probably relax a little bit more, but I should be able to get it to fit against the Draketail successfully. Now, okay, so there's our first piece with a bit of curve to it. Let's put that like so, and let's go ahead with the other pieces. We'll do the next two, the outer pieces, and those are going to, I can't wrap it on here to show you because it'll break, but again, the concave part of the curve will be towards the smaller radius, and the convex outward curve will be towards the larger radius, just as it will be on the Draketail. And again, you know, that you try to bend that much, it's going to break. Okay, so we have number one, and probably as this cools, it won't want to take as sharp a radius as our form, so I wouldn't put it back on there at this point, because this is a smaller, the boat, this would be comparable to a boat being only 2.5 inches wide across the deck, and obviously that's not realistic, but you can see how much that springs back. It springs back dramatically from our initial sharp curve. Okay, into the pot with our other pieces there. We're going to do two this time, and you know, the trick here is going to be getting that, pulling it out of the pot and knowing which end is the more curved end. Because we're going to take this, by the time we get to this part of the curve, here's our piece, by the time we get to this part of the curve, it's not quite as sharp a bend, so we might start this wrap down farther, and by getting out, as we get out here, it's less of a bend still, so we may not pull that in tight against our form, but at the outer end. So the trick will be being able to see which end is the most curved end as you pull them out. You could put a little bit of a C, you know, with pencil, lightly on it with pencil, a C on the more curved end at this point, and that's probably not a bad idea. But once you put it in the water, you probably can't do that very well. So I'll just have to eyeball it and make sure I get the right end. Okay, so we're back to our 5 minutes of timing, and we will let that boil. Okay, there we are. Let's take our pot over to our other work surface. And our mold. Now it's really only after you pull these out of the water, I mean you can't let it sit for very long, but it's only determine which end is which while it's in the water, because you only have seconds after you pull it out of the water. So have your pot right next to your mold, your ceramic mold, and remember we're going to have the curve like a cup, with the inner part of the curve towards the top of the narrower diameter of your mold, and make sure you know which end is the slightly more curved end of your piece and which end is the straighter end. And here we go. This is the first one. Hold it in tight or else you're going to break it. Keep even pressure on it so it doesn't split. Now the more curved end is tight against our mold surface, and the straighter end is curved around but not in tight. I don't think we need that much bend on the straighter end. In fact, slide it down to a larger radius down there a little bit, because there's a little less curve on this piece than on the center piece. Okay. The big trick is to make sure you're pushing it in against your mold, not just bending it hoping it'll stay against, because if you don't push it in against it, you'll probably be pulled away and get just a sharp bend in one part of it, and it'll probably break right there. Okay, and the inner end takes a lot of pressure right here to hold it against there. Okay, and that's cooling now. Hold it just a little bit longer. And there we should have pretty good shape there. See how that, see if I can show you the curve. See how it's holding that curve. Springs back a lot, but it does hold enough of the curve that we should be able to wrap it around the Draketail and glue it. You can see the radius that we're achieving is not as much as the radius of the Draketail, even though we're starting with a mold that is tighter than the Draketail. But we've got enough curve there that we should be able to bend it further to get it to fit on the Draketail. Okay, and our second piece again. Now, the second piece, you have to be careful, because you could wrap it the wrong way and get a second, it has to be the mirror image. Has to be the mirror image of this piece here. If we wrap it so we have two of these pieces, there's no way we'd have to bend it all the way back the other way to work on this part over here. And you see that piece is just simply not going to work there. So so we need to be thinking here. Don't get two starboard pieces or two port pieces. Okay, and again, determine which end is the most curved, and that is going to go on. So now this time we're wrapping the other way around our mold, coming towards us. So the end that doesn't need as much bend is towards me now, whereas before the straighter end was away from me. And it does help to have your pieces laid out the way they're going to go. If you just have them piled up, it's a little bit harder to mentally keep track of what what end goes where, and you're less likely, if you don't have them laid out nicely so you can see what's happening, you're less likely to end up with two mirror images, and you're more likely to end up with two similar pieces that are not mirror images of each other. So a good deal of care. I don't know if this stuff, I kind of have my doubts that if it's bent all the way the wrong way one time, whether you can bend it back all the way the opposite direction second time, even when you boil it thoroughly. It might do it if you boil it enough, but I'd be a little bit hesitant about that. Okay, so this is cool, and I think we can relax that, release that, and again you see how much it bends back, bounces back, but we do have now a permanent curve that should be enough to let us get it around the Draketail successfully. Okay. And over here you can see it's definitely nowhere near as tight a radius as the Draketail, but we have enough curve that it should allow us to fit it to the boat. It's definitely won't lay flat like these pieces here. Okay, on these pieces, now that you've got the technique, why don't we go ahead. Remember, these pieces, it's even more important that you identify which is the more curved end and which is the straighter end, because they have to curve in farther. This part has more curve and this part straightens out more. So it's quite important that you identify these pieces correctly. You can see it easier on these pieces too. And this little tacks our, remember the curve always goes with the hollow part of the curve facing up. This will tax our the surface area of our mold a little bit more because they're such long pieces, but we should still be okay on those. Okay, and into the pot they go. We're starting to get a real pretty watercolor in there. Looks like tea, but I don't think it would taste quite like tea. Okay, so another 5 minutes over here on the stove. Use a timer. It's hard to judge 5 minutes. Okay, here we are. Now, it really is critical to have this pot right beside your ceramic jig, because you only have about 5 seconds to get that on there. The pot's okay. No worries. Just slid into the sink. Remember, push it down in the middle as you bend it. Otherwise you're going to snap these pieces. If you just bend the ends, you're going to snap the piece. So make sure it's pushed down tight in the middle, 2 fingers. Okay? And keep pressure on there, because otherwise it can bow out. It might bow out and snap right there or right here or in the middle. And this middle piece, remember, the middle piece has the sharpest bend, so we're up near the top of our 2.5 inch diameter piece. And although that's a much smaller diameter than the Draketail, it's going to spring back to about half that curve. Make sure it's totally cooled down on that surface before you let it go. And there, number one. And don't leave too long because this water is no longer boiling. Remember the curved end. Okay, I'm going to do this curved end first. And slightly less, slightly not quite as tight a radius on these pieces, and especially down at the bottom at the outer, the straight end is less radius. So I sloped that down my mug, my jig, my ceramic bending jig, and so the straighter end is down farther down where the radius of the mug is slightly more. And I started with the more curved end because, again, just in the time it takes to wrap it around, your piece is cooling off and will not be as will not keep the bend as well. So the curved end I've got very tight. I'm really focusing on that end. The straighter end I'm not as worried about. Just this little difference in radius makes a difference in bending it. I can tell. You know, it took this bend easier than it takes the bend at the sharper, tighter radius at the top of the mug. At the bottom, you know, up here where the radius is less. Okay, and now remember this is here. Let's see if you can see this over here. This is the curved end, more curved here, the straighter end out to the edge. And now remember, on this next piece you have to make sure you have the mirror image of that first piece. So think it out before you take it out of the water, and then, oopsie, almost did that wrong. So now I'm bending it away from me instead of towards me. And there was a moment's delay there before I got it on my mug, so let's see if this works as well. It was probably only 2 seconds of like, oops, got it wrong. I was about to do 2 of my starboard pieces, and then I would have been up the creek with no port piece. So think it out before you take them out of the water, and you can flip them over in the water so they're lying the correct face up. So when you fish it out, and think out which way you're going to wrap it. So because it is a very, very fast thing cooling off here. And that should do it. So, and yes, indeed, we have mirror images on both sets. Congratulations. Well done if you achieved that. It's awfully easy to make that mistake, getting mixed up and not ending up with mirror images. So congratulations if you are looking good at this point. Now on these pieces, we actually will let the surface of the wood dry so we get a better bond with the CA. But it's probably best if you move ahead with this next job as soon as the surface is done of CAing them onto the boat, because we'll assume there's still some inner moisture in the wood, and that moisture inner core of the wood will make them bend more easily around the Draketail, because we still have a fair amount of bending. The Draketail is only about this wide, and you can see our pieces are at a much larger radius at this point, but we should be successful. And again, here's our pot of beautiful, oopsie, where is it? Of really beautiful tinted water. But we're going to dump that out so nobody mistakes it for tea. That is pretty nice. Okay, well done. So let those dry for a few more minutes. These first ones that we did initially are essentially pretty dry. A little bit moist. This one looks a little bit wetter. You can tell how dry they are partly by the color of the wood. When they're wet, they're darker. Okay, now the moment of truth. Gluing on your little Draketail trim pieces. The first step is to mark the center line on the pieces. And I did that on this first piece already, the longer piece, which we're going to glue on first. And I did that by placing what I thought was pretty close to the center of the piece on my ruler. Keep your two sets of pieces separate so you don't end up gluing half of, mixing them up. So I put what I thought was pretty close to the center of my piece right at the 6-inch mark, and then I checked the outside edges, and the outside edge was just a little bit more than 8 1/8, and so I made the other outside corner just a little less than a little over an 1/8 inch from the 4-inch mark, and so those are positioned extending past the 4-inch mark in the negative direction and past the 8-inch mark in a positive direction, giving me a center line right at the 6-inch mark. And mark your center line on the bottom edge of the piece, there, and then do the same with measuring the shorter curved piece. Again, place the center, see if you can see this, place the center right at the 6-inch mark, and then check to see if you have it exactly centered with the outer marks at the ends of the piece. And in this case it's just a little past the 1/2-inch marks, about an 1/8 of an inch, an 1/8 of an inch past the 1/2-inch marks at each side. And so your mark falls right at the 6-inch mark again. Okay, so that's your center line. You're going to have to sand the top one out, not the bottom one, but the top one, so don't make it too dark or too bold. Good, and check it, and that looks good. It's a good time to make sure the ends of your pieces are sanded really smooth. But don't change that angle at all. That angle should be exactly what you want. So don't change the angle, just get the fuzz off. If there's anything that needs to be cleaned up there. So that looks good. Okay, and don't mix up your pieces. A little fuzz on this one too. I want to make sure the fuzz is off the edges and the side and the ends, because it's so easy at this point. But after the fuzz, these are getting glued on with CA. If the fuzz gets full of CA, it's going to be harder to sand, and when it's on, especially when it's in place on the boat. So try to get these edges pretty nice now. Now I need to find the center of the Draketail. That's a little tricky, but not too bad, not too difficult. So I'm going to use my nice ruler here and place it across from side to side, lined up exactly, with one edge lined up exactly with the joint between the Draketail ply and the side plywood. And I'm going to use 6 as my center, and have it spaced evenly, so 6 is in the middle. That means on one side I'm getting measurement of 8 3/4, and the other side I'm getting measurement of 3 1/4, or 3/4 below the 4. And then line your square up precisely. Don't move your ruler. A little fiddly here, but sure you can get it. Okay. Square is lined up with the 6 in the middle, and I'm going to make my little tick mark right there on the Draketail, and then line yourself up on the center line and carry that tick mark down so it's going to show at the bottom of the piece you're putting on. You can also mark the top edge of the plywood. But remember, your piece that we're attaching is going to cover, if you just make a mark on the back side of the Draketail that's not far enough down, the piece that you're gluing on is going to obscure that, so you won't be able to see it. Okay, so we have our little mark, pencil mark there. That's probably not very visible to you. Let's see if you can see it when we get up closer there. I just made a light mark. I don't want to have to sand out a heavy mark. Anyways, right in the center line of the Draketail. Get that back where you can see it. Okay. And now we're ready to start with our Draketail veneer pieces. We're going to use the longer centerpiece first, the longer curved centerpiece first, because we anticipate that we'll have slightly more problems with this piece than with the shorter piece, because this piece has to wrap around farther. And if it splits or cracks or anything, we can repair it with the CA that we're gluing it on with, and make a nice job of it, and then cover it up with the other pieces. Okay, now one consideration is we don't want a lot of CA running down our Draketail, because we have that really nice and smooth now. There's really no easy way to tape the Draketail off or not, so it's more a matter of just getting the right amount of CA onto the veneer piece that we're gluing on. We don't want voids under the piece, but we don't want CA squeezing out either. Okay, so let's see if you can see this. And we're not too rushed with this. Now I'm going to actually spread it as I put it on, rather than having a bead that spreads itself, because I want to make sure I have the right thickness everywhere. Okay, so any small object for spreading will help you in this situation. You can see how thick it is, and you can see that you don't have any voids. Don't glue your finger on though. That's a bit of a trick there, to miss your finger. Okay, and with this CA, since it really takes quite a long time to set up without the accelerator, you have a little bit of time until you spritz it. Okay, and that looks pretty even. I don't think we'll have a whole lot running down from there, but we have enough that if some soaks into the wood, it's not going to leave a dry joint. You have to use the reflected light to get that spread. You can't really have any idea otherwise. Okay, and then we're going to spritz the Draketail where that applies, and quickly line it up very carefully. You need good light with your center line and with the top edge of the Draketail surface plywood. So that alignment is real important there. Okay, now this next piece, these are the pieces that it's hard to tell which end is which. So I want to check the fit and make sure you're getting them on the right side. Look at it carefully, see if you can tell which end is most curved. Okay, I think they go like this, and let's check that fit. The joint should be pretty nice on there, and that looks pretty good. Let's see if we like the other fit better. The end angles are very slightly different on these two. So yeah, that is the better fit there, with judging from the end angle where the two pieces join each other. Although it's hard to tell which end is which at this point, but this end angle definitely works the best for this piece here. Where the two pieces come together is what I mean by the end angle of this piece. A little fuzz on there, get that off. Okay, and then our thin spread of CA. This piece is still a little bit damp, and that's ideal. It'll take the bend a little bit easier, having a little moisture in the wood still. And then spread that CA evenly and check the reflection. Make sure you've got enough CA but no heavy buildup that's going to run and sag and run down the side of the boat. Okay, that looks good. Spritz the hull itself. Make sure you go far enough forwards. It is quite a bit forwards of the quite a bit forwards, and make sure you have a tight joint and that you're lined up along the top edge there. It is quite a bit forwards of the Draketail joint, almost twice as long as to that joint. And that piece takes that curve relatively easily. And then sand the joint nicely. Make sure you're going to have a smooth surface to get your next piece on top of. You don't want to curve it though, you want a flat surface, but you don't want the two ends to be at an angle that's not exactly complementary. It's going to be hard for you to see that. That's a thin bead down the center, and then when I spread it out, it's a sort of a thin, even covering over the whole piece. Lucky this stuff is relatively slow setting up without the accelerator. Okay, but you don't have a whole lot of time, but you should have enough time to get it in place correctly. Okay, generally that went on quite well, and it's fairly smooth. I have a very slight alignment problem. You're not probably going to be able to see it though, where this forward end of the piece is down maybe just 1/100th of an inch, just the slightest bit, a little more than 1/100th, maybe a 50th or something. So I can fudge things a little bit. I can sand this edge of the boat down just a little bit, and then I can sand the bottom edge of that veneer piece up just a little bit. And then when I put my second piece on, I will align my second the cover piece with the top edge of the boat, and there'll be a little bit of a gap there that later on we'll fill with a little epoxy mixture with a little phenolic powder in it, and nobody will ever see it. So good enough. To try to pry this off would be a big mistake. Make quite a mess, I think, of the whole job. So I'm pretty happy with the placement. I think I could have gotten that placement better if I'd been sitting down more at eye level, looking across the edge. But I'm not unhappy with it. To stand up under that edge, you're going to use a real, actually it's one of our marble blocks, and it has a very nice hard square edge. So I should be able to just sand up the bottom edge of that veneer piece just a little bit, so it's not going to be sticking down below the other veneer piece. And this is just my 220 grit sandpaper. I don't want to take off very much. It's only a very small bit, and I can sand a little bit more if I need to with the other piece on top to line up the two pieces. Okay, there, quite nice. And then again, you probably need a little smoothing where those two pieces come together, because you want your top piece to have a smooth surface to lie down on. So check, make sure that's perfectly smooth right there where the two join, and then sand along the rest of it. Make sure there are no bumps or irregularities. I had just the start of a little teensy split right in here, which to keep it from developing, I added, after I had the piece in place, I added a little CA there and spritzed it and held it down tightly in place. You won't ever be able to see that, but it's the start of a little split there, which is taken care of now. So you can do a lot with the CA. Just be patient, and if something splits a little bit, when something splits, put the CA as much as you can in between the split surfaces, but then work the split up and down just a little bit, pushing up and down so the CA is sucked in there, almost like a reverse bellows, and then spritz it and hold it tight. And to hold it tight so my finger didn't get stuck on, I was using the Sharpie, the bottom of the Sharpie pen, pushing it in tight, and the CA really doesn't seem to stick very well to the Sharpie pen, so that worked out quite well. Do take your time to get this surface totally smooth and flat, because that will make the second piece of veneer go on top smoothly. Oh, and then one detail that I'd forgotten we had anticipated and taken care of is this. And this is important. The real reason for doing this shorter curved piece second after on the top surface is that we've made these straight pieces long enough that when the short piece is centered exactly on the Draketail, the long pieces come out and overhang your original piece by almost 1/4 of an inch. So when everything's glued up and set, you'll be able to very easily saw off the end of the piece that's on the surface, on the top, and have the two pieces then exactly flush with each other. So if you did it in the reverse order, the bottom piece would be longer and the top piece would be short, and you'd have to be trying to saw off the bottom piece, which is difficult because you'd probably scratch the side of the boat in trying to saw right down to the side. That would be a tricky maneuver. Not impossible, but a lot easier to saw off the top piece, or even you could sand it back, but sand it or saw it, whichever is going to be safer. Okay, so get this surface exactly right, exactly smooth, because your top veneer has to go right over all this smoothly, or else you'll have trouble with it. Okay, now this is the veneer that shows. The first layer isn't quite as critical. Make sure you can see your center lines still. Those are a little hard to see after you spritz the surface. And do a trial run there. And make sure it looks good. And when it looks good, now you're lining it up exactly flush with the top edge of the first veneer piece, which is flush with the top edge of the Draketail plywood. We'll get back on the stand. Let me simplify things. Okay. Run your finger along that edge. Make sure it all feels smooth, with no bumps or irregularities, because any irregularity here will cause you a problem. Okay. The other pieces out of the way, and get some sort of little spreader stick to spread the CA along smoothly and evenly, and hold on to your piece here. That's going to go on just like that. Make sure check your center lines again, make sure you can see them. I'm going to make my center line just a little bit bolder, because I did have trouble seeing it after I spritzed it. So I'm going to make my center line on the Draketail just a little bit bolder, more pronounced, because I had trouble seeing that when I spritzed it. And maybe I'll make this center line a little clearer too. Give yourself every advantage you can. Okay, and now the CA on this piece, right down the center line of the piece, right down the center of the piece. And that's a thin bead. And then when I spread it out, it covers very evenly. If on your first pieces you had any squeezing out and starting to want to run down or come out the bottom of the joint, then do this one a little bit lighter and see if you can get it, finesse it just right. Don't have the ends be dry though, because the ends are where it really takes most of the pressure. Okay, and here we go. Spritz the boat. You want to spritz it thoroughly. If you miss someplace spritzing, that part is not going to set up as fast. You might release too soon. Line it up carefully and press it in place quickly. Press the ends down especially, pull the ends apart so the middle stays tight, and that should be doing it. This short piece is probably the easiest to put on. Don't get your fingers glued. Keep your fingers clear. Nice. We'll have an option of sanding this down a little bit. Looks at this stage it looks a little bit thick and clunky even. But we'll be rounding it just enough that it looks really elegant and smooth. Whereas if we just had the single piece on there, we really wouldn't be able to round it at all. So the double layers is going to be really, really sweet. And just make sure the outer edges of these, don't change the angle at all, or else your pieces won't meet nicely. Make sure the outer edge doesn't have any fuzz or anything to interrupt it. Good light is really helpful here. If you're working half in the shadow and then you move a project into good light after you finish it, you can see all the flaws. So use good light initially when you're doing your project, rather than to check your project after it's too late. So use the good light while you're doing it right off. Okay, that looks good. You know, on these edges, the finish edges, you could undercut it just the slightest a bit, so you make sure you, on the front edge, do you see how we're doing? We're beveling that end, undercutting it just a little bit, so that the surface will be sure to butt up tight, because we're not going to notice that undercut at all, but we will see if the surface isn't butting up tight. We're just at about a 30-degree angle there, and we don't want to change the angle at the end, just a little bevel there on the back end where we're going to join it to the other veneer. So just about that angle, less than 45 degrees. And try fitting it. Do your dry fit, and it looks really good. The front end is where I have my problem, right up in here. So you'll want to make sure that that is flush and level, because if it drops down a little bit, it's going to be hard to make it as clean a look. Okay, and make sure your more curved end is towards the back of the Draketail. Don't get nervous. If your hands start shaking at this point, take a break. Remember, it's just a boat. You really don't want these to be too dry, because you don't want them to start releasing 6 months from now. Ooh, I got some on my fingers there. So I'll have to be careful not to glue myself on here. Okay, and spritz, 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 spritz. Plenty of... Oopsie. Where's the aim? You need plenty of the accelerator. Oh, got a little chip of wood there. Get that out of there. Uh-oh. Sticking fingers together. And get it on there and in place and back tight against your other piece of veneer so there's no gap there, hopefully. Check the front end. Down just a little bit, but I think we're pretty close. You don't have much time there. Pretty darn quick. You're not really gonna move it after it hits down. A little bit low, just a little bit right there. But overall, I think it's looking pretty darn clean. Okay. And the truth of the matter is that you won't even remember the details by the time you finish the project. You won't remember the little detail that you thought, oh no, I didn't get that good enough, or I didn't get that perfect. You won't be able to see it. It's not going to stand out. So part of the fun of modeling is doing this kind of fun detail work and knowing that it is going to turn out well and be beautiful, but does not have to be perfect, that nobody will ever see it and you won't remember that it's not perfect. If you get frustrated with it because it's not perfect, you're not going to enjoy the modeling aspect of this very well. Okay, and I am coming out right. This is the more curved part here, which goes towards the center of the Draketail, or towards the back end of the Draketail. And so this is my last piece. The excitement of this is significant. I'm trying to keep from getting too excited though, so I can work steadily and keep my hands from shaking, because it does take a steady hand to apply this and get the smooth bead. But it's fun. It's exciting. Okay, spreading out my bead. You know, it's a little harder using these spreading sticks when the with the hardened CA on them. So get another piece of little scrap wood to spread with, and don't feel you have to stick with one piece, because the buildup of CA on the end makes it a little bit rough and not spread easily. Okay, and right there where my finger is holding it. This time I'll try not to get my fingers glued on. I glued my fingers together a little bit last time, but not too bad. Okay, and then spritzing. Fairly heavy with the spritzing, or else you're going to find that it didn't, if you miss someplace, it won't set up there. And shoot. Okay, I think we got it. After an initial flurry of not doing so well, I think we got it just right. Yeah, very nice. Okay, nice joints. The joints look really good, and it's setting up just right. Yep, nice. Great. So there. I'm sure it's not going to pull away. Oh, it wasn't quite set there. A little bit longer. Don't let go too soon. You might have it perfect and then you let go and the end pops off. That's not good. Anyway, just a little bit at the top there. So I'm going to work in a little bit of CA right along the top edge. Don't overdo it here though. Real fine bead there, and then pumping it to make sure that CA doesn't just sit on the top surface, it works itself down. And I have a little time here because I haven't spritzed it yet, and actually with this joint I'll spritz it, but I can only spritz the surface, so it'll take it just a little bit longer for the spritzing to have an effect. Okay, and then tight together. It was joined together farther down. It wasn't, the whole piece wasn't loose, but right at the top edge I was seeing a little bit of a gap there. Now we can also coat, we have a few more tricks up our sleeve on these pieces. We can also coat with epoxy, and the epoxy will do a nice fill. Anywhere there might be a little teensy gap between two veneer pieces, or between the veneer piece and the plywood, and I can see a few small gaps there. So the epoxy will do a nice fill and be invisible. And varnish will also fill, if it's a very, very small tight gap, the varnish when we apply the varnish will fill as well. So between the epoxy and the varnish, you're going to fill any gaps there and have that really tightly adhered, and I don't think you'll ever have any problem with that at all. Now, if your edges are really pleasingly lined up, great, that's perfect, and you may just have to live with a little CA on your fingers for a while. You could wear plastic gloves, but you need tight-fitting plastic gloves in this case, or else they're just going to get in everything, and you might even glue them in underneath your trim piece, and that would not be helpful. So you may just have to live with a little CA on your fingers. CA is not known to cause any allergic reactions, though. So you know, it's not like getting epoxy on your fingers where you really want to get it off right away. Just don't glue your fingers together. That could be awkward. There is a CA release agent that you can get at hardware stores if you are worried about gluing your fingers together. that might be a good thing to have on hand. And don't glue your finger to your boat. That could be awkward and make your perfect joint pull apart to get your finger back. And now let's get a little sanding on that and clean it up. And you can sand the thickness of this is 120, is it? Yeah, 120. The thickness of this trim piece is not absolutely, you can, if you didn't get perfect alignment, you can sand these pieces a little bit thinner. You can sand from the bottom edge to get the pieces lined up the bottom edge. You can sand from the top edge, get them lined up at the top edge. So none of this is set in stone, or it's up to your discretion and your aesthetic sense. Some of these details. However, if we sand this piece thinner, you can see, if we sand this piece thinner up here, then the piece that runs along the hull will want to sand a little bit thinner too. Oh, one last note. Look what we've done here. Look how strong this joint is now. We have 2 layers of mahogany, African mahogany veneer glued on top of each other, reinforcing this joint that otherwise didn't have a lot of, it was fairly strong, but it didn't have a lot of reinforcing before. But now that joint is super strong. And don't think you're going to ever be successful in that project without boiling those pieces first. And it's a good idea. I left about 2 hours after boiling them before gluing them on, and wanted the surfaces of the pieces to look fairly dry, but they didn't look entirely dry. There were still sort of darker spots on them. But I did want the inside of the wood still to be somewhat wet, high moisture content, because I knew it would bend in place more easily with less chance of splitting. So, so I didn't want it to be 24 hours later after boiling. I wanted it just to be a couple hours, maybe depending on the temperature and humidity of where you're working. Maybe just 1 hour or even half an hour if it's really hot and dry where you are. So you're sort of trying to finesse this a little bit. And the more you finesse it, the better the results. Okay, now you can see how nicely these pieces are starting to sand out and round out. And they don't really have to be as wide as they are, initially when you stick them on. So if you have any alignment problems, just sand them a little bit skinnier. There's no magic to how wide those are. We really give them to you a little bit wider than we imagine they have to be to look nice. They could be almost, well, 1/8 of an inch would be a lot of sanding, but they can definitely be sanded down to 1/4 of an inch if you have any alignment problems. And rounding the top helps make them look really smooth and elegant. And so just working away at this, and any alignment problems will probably start to blend in and go away. One note, when you're sanding around the transom, the Draketail, you pretty much have to sand parallel to the mahogany grain, which means you're sanding perpendicular to the Draketail grain. So you could start with the 120 grit, but if you have 150 or 180, actually I would start with 150 or 180 actually, because with the 120 even, if you hit that Draketail ply very much, you're going to put dramatic scratches in it that are going to take a lot more work to sand out with finer grit. So as you work around the back, I would try to stick to your, anytime you're going to be touching that Draketail ply, I would try to stick with the 120 grit paper, even though it is going to take a little longer to get the sanding done. You won't then have to sand out scratches, perpendicular scratches on the Draketail ply. And use sharp. If you're using sharp 120, it actually cuts pretty quickly. If you just keep using the same old piece of 120, you know, ad infinitum, it'll start getting pretty dull and not cut very well. That's something that a lot of people don't understand about sandpaper, is that it gets, like any tool, it gets dull and stops working as well. Just because it still has some visible sand on the surface doesn't mean those sand particles are sharp anymore. They're all rounded and don't cut. So you can just keep working. It's kind of fun. It's like polishing something beautiful. You can just keep working at this to get it exactly where you want. And as I say, we'll use a little epoxy along the top edge, so any little gaps will fill, and then the varnish will also fill any gaps that might be left. So just keep working away at it, and just try not to get one part of your rail really skinny and leave other parts really wide. That would look a little bit inconsistent. So try to get the entire rail sanded down together. Don't just sand aggressively at one place. It's best to keep the whole thing sanding down all at the same time. Okay, well, I think you're starting to get the idea about how nice that can look. Even though your alignment may not have been perfect at the beginning, as you sand, it takes care of all sorts of things. So just keep working away at it until you're happy with it. That's probably, you know, that's getting close. Actually, it's not too bad. I'll be doing more sanding on it, but at the front edge, you don't really want to complete the sanding on the front ends of these pieces until you've got the piece that runs along the entire side attached and a nice joint there, because you want to sand that down together. If you sand this one perfect, it's easier to sand them down together. It'll look more uniform. On this front piece, there are a couple of options. One, you could, since you have a little bit of overlap here, overhang on the top veneer piece, you could notch the front piece, the long one, so it sticks in underneath that and has an overlap joint instead of just a butt joint. That would be kind of a neat detail. Or you could just use a very fine hobby saw and saw through that top surface. If you're going to do that, I'd recommend taping blue tape on your hull and up underneath that joint. So if your hobby saw angle isn't perfect, you scrape the blue tape instead of putting a scrape mark on your plywood. Okay, but I like the idea of notching that under, you know, there. That kind of detail can be really cute and add a whole nother dimension to your boat. Okay, going great. It looks awfully cute, and you'll love it when we get when you add this strip along the hull shape, along the entire gunnel, the mahogany strip along the gunnel. It just adds a tremendous dimension to the boat. Starts looking very sleek and elegant. Just a very quick job here. Mix one large mark of pre-thickened resin with one small mark of hardener, and spread that especially thickly along the edges of your RC deck. Not your RC deck, your engine bed, because you want to seal up that joint between the sides and the bed. And then we'll use the rest to coat the engine bed. Sort of like a clear coat, but it's a little bit thicker, so it'll build up a little bit more, but we're not concerned. This is pretty much hidden down here. We're not concerned about getting a perfect clear coat on here. You can do little fillets in the corners with the pre-thickened, but especially sealing the edges, because if sometime later you decide to add a steam engine, or if you're doing the steam engine version, instead of the electric. You want the any water or oil from the steam engine to be contained in your engine compartment, engine bed here, and not to get down the bilge. So you're trying to do a watertight seal here along the edges. Okay, and then coat the rest of the platform to waterproof it and get the rest of the way around the edge. You may find that one large mark is not quite enough. So probably better start with 2 large marks for the engine bed. Okay, let's get the RC deck glued in. This is really not used with the electric version, but if it's nice to glue it in anyway, even if you are planning on the electric version, because at some date somebody, yourself or somebody else, might want to switch to a steam engine in the boat, and then you'll be all set up ready for it. And it's just a quick project to get this glued in. Starting point is to sand the edges beveled underneath, so they fit down, so the piece fits down flat on your fillets. And it should be all the way back against flush with the 7AB bulkhead, tight against there. And you want to make sure that your little push rod hole here is not being blocked by it. So it should be just right along the bottom edge of that push rod hole there. And this is looking pretty good. I've done most of the sanding already. And a little bit of a lump right here. And you can alternate between sanding the fillet smooth on the inside and sanding the bottom of your RC deck. So getting that lump right there, down a little bit, and then I can sand a little bit the same place on the bottom of my RC deck. It also works well to have your paper on the table and just sand by rubbing against it like that. This is the 120 grit, I think. Yeah, 120, but it's a fairly new piece, so it's cutting quite quickly. Okay, and then make sure that you have your RC deck sitting in there when it's sitting in there nice. I've done quite a bit of sanding already, beveling underneath both sides on the bottom of that. Let's see if we have it sitting level. Here we are. Just 1.5 inches, almost exactly there, and 1.5 inches, almost exactly there. So yeah, that looks like it's sitting level there, and we're all set and ready to glue that in now. So we'll mix up, let's go ahead and mix up 2 large marks of epoxy for this job, and our brush and pot are still liquid enough from doing the engine bed that we can use the same pot. But in case we have amine blush on the fillet surfaces or anything, you want to wipe those surfaces down with, in this case I'm going to use, you can use acetone or this isopropyl rubbing alcohol will work. You could use water. In fact, that wouldn't be too bad because these wood surfaces are coated now, so you're not going to get the wood wet and it'll dry fairly quickly. So warm water would work. The advantage of acetone or the alcohol is it dries. Those both work well and they dry pretty much instantly. If you're gluing on top of set up epoxy that has an amine blush on top of it, usually you can tell if you wipe your finger over the surface, it'll feel a little bit oily almost, and it'll leave, you'll see some marks on the surface when you get reflected light on it. I don't really think I've got any amine blush on these surfaces, so anyway, it's always a good precaution to wipe them down. If you are concerned about really a lot of strength and adhesion, it'd be nice to sand those fillets a little bit, but we're really not going to have a lot of load on the servo deck, so we're not really worried about it. Okay, so I think we're ready to glue that in, but I'm going to do one more sort of prep thing here. I'm going to measure again, make sure I've got that sitting correctly the way I had it before. Yeah, and that looks good. Then I'll draw a pencil line across there, just so when I glue it in I can check the pencil line without and not have to use my ruler against the sticky surfaces. Okay, so two pre-thickened, and we'll coat the bottom of the RC deck and around the edges and across the back of the 7AB bulkhead. Then we'll add some phenolic powder and create some fillets. One other note here on the RC deck, you can see that cutout is not centered, and the cutout, the notch or rectangular cutout in the RC deck is meant to be off center, and it's off center towards closer to the port side of the boat, the left hand side of the boat when you're standing behind the boat. In the photograph, in the video, you can see it's off center to the right hand side, which means it's on the port side. The notch is closer to the port side of the boat if you were looking from behind the boat instead of from in front of the boat. So don't put that in upside down. And now I'll add phenolic powder to get a non-sag mixture. Make sure it's back tight and let it set up. It is lined up exactly right with our pencil line that we put in there for alignment, and it's level and horizontal in both directions. Now while we're at it, and since we have a little extra epoxy from gluing the RC deck, let's just quickly use that extra epoxy on these keel pieces. Either the inner pieces for the keel, we'll just take two of them. In the end, they will be laminated up so they're 4 thick. The same 4 of these inner thicknesses, so they'll be the same thickness as the as the propeller shaft and propeller shaft tube. And it's going to be easier if you clean these up first. Be careful of the little end piece back here. If that breaks off, you can glue it back on, but it's easier not to have to. And be careful at the front where it's so skinny and delicate. So support that as you sand it, as you sand the tabs off. And if it's warm, you have to do this quickly if you're going to get that leftover epoxy on here. But I think you'll be okay. If you don't get it in time, then you can mix more epoxy. Okay, I think we're just in time. We can use the pre-thicken, with the phenolic powder in it. With all the surface area, we'll get plenty of adhesion and strength. And then there's really no load on these parts. You do want to spread it fairly thin, or else your two pieces. And I've got a little wood dust here and stuff from the sanding. I don't want to get that in my mixture because that'll hold the parts of two pieces apart, and we won't get a tight bond. This is a little bit thicker than ideal, but it's not. It's going to work fine. Just don't have any lumps or heavy buildups, because it'll be harder to squeeze them together evenly if you have a thick area in one place and a thin area someplace else. And a little tricky down here on the skinny part, but not too bad. Okay, and there we go. Stick your second part on top and line those up. And again, we're going to weight these pieces because when you weight them against the table surface, they'll turn out flat. So whatever you have for flat weights, you don't want to cover the entire piece, because then you can't see if it's stayed lined up or not, and the alignment is important. So don't cover the entire piece. In fact, I'm going to put that one there, this one here, and then I have one more big flat piece here. Okay, and I can still see the back edge. Make sure that's lined up, and the front edge, and that's lined up. And yeah, that's pushing together well. Although, wouldn't hurt to have another just in case. There. Oops. There we go. Okay, and I have a little bit more epoxy. Let's see what else we can put together here. Yeah, I can take, I don't want to take the center punch out of the deck yet, because I want the deck a little bit stronger. But I can take these pieces, steel pieces out here, and without knocking the whole center of the deck out, the oblong cockpit out. And then we'll get these glued up too at the same time. Hey, pulling these out, you might want to use a knife on this, so you don't break the delicate parts, but I got it out okay. And you still have your crust pieces, so that's still keeping that stable. And so sanding these up, again, you're working against your epoxy setting up here. If you are watching the video before starting the process of each step, it would be a good idea to get these pieces ready before you mix your epoxy, and then you can get them together more quickly. But I'm working in a fairly cool room. You can see several sweaters and stuff. So I have more time than you may have to get these pieces ready. So prep work is a good idea. And again, we're going to have just enough epoxy for this job. No extra. I'm going to scrape the container pretty dry. And then you can scrape off so it's farther up on the brush, so you get it on the tip of the brush so you can use it better. Where we're concerned about strength, we'll always coat both surfaces, but in this case, with all this surface area, one surface will work fine. And there we go, just right. And we'll get some more flat weights on that, just like this one, and we'll be all set. So anytime you have extra epoxy, this is one of the types of jobs that you can fit in anywhere, and doesn't take. You can prep these earlier, and it doesn't take much time to get them together when you have some extra epoxy. So rather than just waste the epoxy or have it set up in your container, which is a nuisance because then your container's not it's going to start filling up with epoxy and not be quite as easy to use. It's great to do one of these small jobs like these. These are the keel pieces. They're the inner part of the keel piece. So the rudder shaft comes down. Where's it come? It comes down at this angle here, and these two pieces that we just glued together, we glued two together and two together. They will, in the next stage, be glued together, so there are four of them together. You potentially could glue all four of them together at once, but it's just a lot harder to get the alignment really accurate if you have four pieces that are skidding and slithering against each other. So I find it easier just to do two, and then glue those two together. Now we've mixed up one large mark of pre-thickened resin with a small amount of phenolic powder in it. You can see that that's still going to sag. See how that's sagging, falling off the brush? But it's not dripping off. It's just kind of sagging off. That's just how we want it. Now here are veneer strips, 1/16 inch veneer for along the edge, and we're getting ready to fit that. It'll fit right underneath the outer layer of Draketail veneer. So rather than a double butt joint, we'll just have one concealed butt joint there, and then one surface butt joint. But the two joints are not lined up. If they're lined up, that's okay, but it's kind of neat to have them not lining up. On a full-size boat, that would give you more strength in that joint. And so we can fit this and hold it in place with a couple of paper clamps, binder clips, and then we can go up to the bow. Make sure your back joint is tight. Put enough binder clips on that joint will stay in place. And then we'll go up to the bow and get the bow fit and shaped so the two sides will come together nicely. Okay, so now we have it all clamped in place well enough, not well enough for the final gluing, but well enough to get a sense of how our bow is going to go together. So we'll work on the bow here, and we'll zoom in on that to give you an idea of how we're going to do that. Okay, let's get the front edge marked, and then we'll cut it. Now there are a couple ways you can do this. We want the two outwales to come together. There'll be two on this side, two layers on this side, and two layers on this side. I want them to come together in a nice V, so each side has to be beveled to match the other side. Probably the easiest way to do this is to take your outwale and slide it back. So you just barely have enough at the front for your bevel. And the reason we're doing this is because it'll be much easier to cut off the back where it's just a square cut than it will be, and to get that accurate so it meets just really perfectly, that'll be much easier than it will be. So at the back now I have an inch overlapping there. So at the front now I'm just a little bit of extra for that, just a little more than I need for my bevel. Okay, so now we have that in place there. Let's get a center line on the deck. So I'm measuring 5 inches across, so 2.5 inches for the center line. Just a real light mark because you're going to have to you want to remove that before you varnish that mark. And then right through the center. Remember, the pencil itself has some width. Without that center line mark on your deck, this would be fairly difficult to get accurate. And it's still a little bit fiddly. But since we have enough overlap at the back, we can try this. We can if we don't get that angle perfect to start with, we can keep working with it. And we have a whole inch of extra material at the back. So to bevel that, the easiest way is just rubbing it on a piece of sandpaper. And let's see, move the boat aside so you can see a little bit better. So just like if you ever used to sharpen popsicle sticks for fun as a kid on the sidewalk, this is probably the easiest way to do it. Now, I had a little, my end wasn't perfect. There's a teensy bit of chipping out at the very end from the way it was cut, so I'm going to sand it back just a little bit. Get rid of that. Any chipping out on the end. And square. And then sand my bevel. Now, these sides are sloping out just a little bit. So if I just sanded a totally square bevel, the bottom edges would hit, but the top edges would not hit. I'd rather have the top edges hit because that's where we're seeing it. So I'm going to sand a little bit of an angle into that bevel. So the top edges are going to hit, and the bottom edges will hit pretty nicely, but nobody will ever notice those. So a little angle into that bevel. Not too much. Not very. The sides aren't sloping out very much, or aren't sloping in out very much towards the deck. You can check your pencil line if you can still see it. I think I sanded my pencil line away by now. But just doing the pencil line gives you some idea of what angle you're going to want there. Okay. Now I'm getting close. I think my angle is not quite steep enough. That's a pretty narrow bow. And remember, it's just half that bow angle. If you did this, because each side's going to be half the angle. So I'm pulling that bevel back a little bit sharper angle. And let's try it again. That's looking pretty good. Now I won't really be able to tell how good it is until I get the other side in place. So, look at your veneer. Certainly if there are any flaws, put the flaws on the inside piece, the one we're doing now, and save the best piece for the outside. But all my pieces look real nice, so I'm good. So my second bevel for the second side, slanting it just a little bit the opposite direction, the mirror image. And let's see what we've got here. Okay, now we can really tell how we're doing when we put these two together. And again, they're at the back end, they're way long, so I can just keep working away and finesse this. Once I get the bevel correct though at the bow, neither angle is steep enough. I've got a big gap at the front, so I got to get those angles way farther back. I'm thinking almost 1/4 inch or more, maybe. And let's see this one. You want them both to be pretty close to the same too. Okay, let's see what we've got now. So it's just a matter of sand and fit, sand and fit, sand and fit until you're happy. Okay, now that's looking a lot closer. Much closer there. In fact, I think we're probably pretty good. Let's see. Yeah, see how nice a fit that is? That looks great. We're going to round that a little bit at the very bow, but that is essentially a very nice fit. Okay, now you really need both pieces in place to tell how long it's supposed to be at the front. So let's get our paper or binder clips on here to hold both pieces in place here. and then we'll work back along the edge, and then we'll come back and check the front, make sure we've still got good alignment with the two pieces, between the two pieces. That's probably enough. I don't think we have to work all the way back to check our alignment at the front, and if the alignment at the front isn't good, we'll have to take these off and redo them. So I'd say about halfway back will be enough. Okay, then come back up to the front. And these veneer strips that we're adding should be just exactly flush with the top edge of the side. And that does. I'm gonna move back a little bit so I can see a little bit better. Yeah, that does look just, I can't get any more perfect than that. I like that a lot. Okay, and now I can work all the way back with my binder clips and measure the back end. Now the back end, of course, remember you're measuring not to the outside layer of veneer, but to the inside layer of veneer, which is a little bit longer than the outside layer. And we're going to make a pencil mark where we think it should be. But we're going to make it a teensy bit long. And then we'll try fitting it, because we can always make it shorter, but we can't make it longer. Okay, and then cutting this, there are a few options. Probably your best option is a hobby saw, although anything, we don't want to scrape our beautiful hull sides, because that would mean we had to fill them to get a good finish. Another good option is a pair of these are not garden shears, but they're almost like garden shears, where this is actually a mat knife blade, comes down against a plastic flat anvil here, plate. That will work. I think scissors may crunch the end more than you want. So I'm going to use the hobby saw, and a real fine hacksaw blade is not too bad, but not quite as good as the hobby saw, because the teeth are going to be a little more jagged. And I'm going to try not to mess up my side, because I don't want to have to make extra. I don't want to make extra work for myself. So let's try a block of wood here and see if that's going to work. And we're trying to go virtually perpendicular to the piece of veneer. So I'm always a little bit lazy about everything, and then I'm sorry, because I don't get the results I want when I'm lazy. So I'm going to mark a perpendicular line to saw to, instead of just trying to eyeball that as perpendicular. Now again, if there's going to be a gap, I'd rather the gap be on the bottom side where nobody will see it. So do your line either perpendicular or slightly angled, angling forwards a bit. And definitely protect your side, because otherwise you're going to nick your side. Okay, and here we go. Okay, now see how I did. Ooh, that looks nice. Just a teensy bit of sanding, I think, will fit right in there. See, when I put it in now, it bows out a little bit here. Generally, really fine work is more a matter of technique. Some of it's skill, but more it's a matter of technique. Just knowing that if you try to cut it exactly the right length, it's half the time it's going to come out a little bit short. So, so if you cut it over length, and then sand and fit, sand and fit, sand and fit. Of course, you have to be careful sanding. You don't twist the piece too much and break it. Sand a little bit, so that's a little bit closer, but we're still getting bowing out here. If I push that bow forwards, my bow won't work. So, so I have to sand it out, and the piece shorter. You think, well, why didn't he just cut it the right length to start with? Yeah, but you're never going to get it perfect if you try to cut it exactly the right length to start with. Well, I could have cut it a little closer. I'm having to sand a little more than I want to. Although, you know, I was only at most, well, I was less than a 32nd too long. So I wasn't, you just try to sand off a 1/4 inch. It's going to take a long time. So that's probably about 64th longer than would fit perfectly. So I didn't leave a whole lot of extra margin. Now we're still bowing out a little bit, even when we push it all the way down, but we're getting pretty darn close now. That's super close. Still a teensy bit of bowing out, and the bow really is just right, so I'm going to sand it a little bit more to get that bow totally out. Although I do want a tight butt joint here, I don't want it to be extra space. There, now it's perfect. No bowing out at all. Fits right in there. And our bow's perfect, and we've got it perfect back here. So I'm looking real good. If we can do as well on the other side, I'll be very pleased. The other side, I'm still going to do it a little bit long, but maybe I won't do quite as much sanding on it. Okay, and again, I want to protect my hull. You do have to be fairly somewhat delicate with this thin veneer. Okay, so I think you've got the idea on that. I'm going to cut this side and fit it, and then sand it and fit it, and sand it and fit it until it's perfect. And then we'll be back and we'll spread our epoxy and get these clamped in place. Okay, now I just want to mention an odd phenomenon that we've noticed over the years. Sometimes the most careful, precise builders will make the biggest mistakes because they'll be so focused on doing something perfect that they won't see the big picture somehow. And the big picture in this case is spreading the correct side of this piece of wood, because you've done such a nice job at the bevel, on the bevel at the front. If you spread the epoxy on the wrong side of this piece, it's going to be a bit of a mess cleaning it up. Now, of course, this is the inner piece, so you could rescue it and mix more epoxy and spread it. But don't spread the wrong side of your piece. And now, as far as spreading this, I think, can you see where I'm working? You know, I just wanted to point out, one of the reasons I'm not wearing gloves more for this project is because I'm filming it, and if I get epoxy on my gloves and then I go to turn the camera off or on or move the camera angle, zoom in or something, I'll get epoxy all over my camera, which I don't like. So normally I'd wear gloves more and protect my fingers that way, but with the camera involved, I just have to keep everything. I have to keep my fingers. I can't get any epoxy on my fingers whether I have gloves on or not, and if I have gloves on, it's harder to tell if I have any epoxy on my fingers, and it's more likely to get on the camera. So definitely do not follow my example unless you're filming and don't want to get epoxy on your camera. Okay, now the key here in spreading this is to have a good even coverage. Use a reflected light. Make sure your coverage is even. It's really hard to tell just by looking at it if you don't have any light reflecting off of it. So use reflected light, and the real key is to have the right consistency. If you have it too runny, it's really going to. One issue is it may all soak into the wood and leave a dry joint, and it's going to be running off and not giving a thick enough coat. I'm not going to coat the boat side. I'm just coating the piece we're sticking on. And if it's too runny, you won't get quite a thick enough coat. If it's too thick, you'll probably have quite a bit too thick a coat because it won't spread out very evenly or easily. And Then what you're going to end up, I'm going to do the end just a little bit on the end too, where it's doing the butt joint. If it's too thick, you're going to end up with some areas that are heavier build up and some that are lighter. You go to clamp it on, and underneath where you put your binder clips, you're going to have a lot of squeeze out because you put it on too heavily. In between the binder clips, you're going to have it held out by too much epoxy. So this was definitely a sagging mixture. It does have the phenolic in it, and but it would not stay on the brush for more than a few seconds before it started to sag off. Okay, so get your back end slatted in. Now at the back end, make sure it's flush at the bottom with your Draketail piece, because you can sand the top edge off easily, but you can't sand the bottom edge off nearly as easily. It's not impossible, but it's difficult to sand, the outwale veneer without messing up the edge of your hull plywood at the same time, scratching it and having to sand it smooth more. Okay, so make sure you get so I'm a little proud on the top surface, but I am lined up just right at the bottom surface, which is good because this top surface will sand down very, very easily. And space your clips, your binder clips, about 3 inches apart, I think will do. And this should just lie on perfectly smoothly. And now along the top edge, when I look, I get reflected light. I can see, a little shiny, very, very small bead, but there's no real squeeze out. I mean, I'm not getting. And so along the bottom edge, I really shouldn't have to do any cleanup. I don't really want to do cleanup along the bottom edge because it'll be a little messy if I have to clean up a lot of resin squeezing out the bottom edge. I could do it, but it's neater if you can just get just finesse the right amount of epoxy on there, so you're not having squeeze out. And on the top edge, get those binder clips are centered in the piece. Don't have them down too far. Okay, those look good. On the top edge, any squeeze out I can clean up easily with sanding. And make sure that you have an even amount sticking out. If you have a little, right at the back, I have a little bit of my piece that I'm sticking on there is a little bit proud of the top edge of the plywood, and so, but then it got higher up in here, so I'm pushing it down. You can only tell these things by changing your angle of sight. From above it looked good, but when I looked at it from this level, it was like down just a little bit proud here, and then standing up too high there. So if I'd left it that way and then sanded the top down, it wouldn't have been an even thickness, even width, as I looked at it from the side, and that would have been a little bit disturbing from the side view. Okay, and we're going all the way up to the bow, but I'm going to take off this other piece because I haven't spread epoxy on it yet, of course, so I don't want it to get glued on. And you'll notice at the bow you have to pull it up significantly because the bow starts to curve up there. And then at the very front, where the heart-shaped bow piece is going to set in, I had that sitting here. Try not to lose your pieces. In fact, it's good to have a little basin or bin to put the small pieces in. It's probably just under my tools here. Anyway, where that heart-shaped piece sits in at the very bow, you can see the sides are notched for it. Make sure you don't have a lot of epoxy squeezing out there, because then you'll have to You can bevel the bottom edge of the heart-shaped piece without it showing, but it'd be nice if it just fits right in there nicely without too much work. So whatever epoxy squeezes out right there at the front, that little cutout, try to use some kind of little tool to clean that out. Okay, and you may wonder why I'm not. So make sure the bow at the front, it really does curve up a lot right at the very front. So make sure you've got it up there and that it stays up there, following the shear of the boat, shear line. Now you may wonder why I'm not clamping up in here. Well, partly because I want to be able to clean out the epoxy, and partly when I get the second side, I'm going to put a paper clamp right at the very bow, squeezing them together. Okay, so I think you now check your butt joint and make sure that's as tight as you want it. Mine could be a teensy bit tighter, but it's pretty darn. It's a pretty good joint. It's very close. So I'm happy with that, and I'll check. Yeah, that bow still looks perfect. That's a very visible place. It's nice when the bow comes together just right. Okay, so I'm going to spread epoxy on my second side, and then be back with you here in a minute. Okay, and that turned out we had just the right amount of resin. We had mixed up one large mark of pre-thickened resin with one small mark of hardener, and that was just enough to finish coating the second piece. I couldn't have gotten another. I might have gotten another inch coated, but I didn't have any extra. So again, that will give you a good sense of whether you're spreading it about the right thickness. And the real test on this piece is you should be able to see a little bead along the top, just a very narrow bead, just a little shiny light there, not squeezing out though. And along the bottom edge, you should really not be able to see any squeeze out at all, even right under the clamps, because if you get squeezing out, it's going to be a bit of a mess trying to get that cleaned up neatly. And to leave it and then try to sand it will be even harder. So if you need to, you can make sort of a chisel. Use a little scrap of the veneer would work really nicely, and sand it into a chisel point, and then you can scrape with that right along the bottom edge of your veneer piece. But don't get your clamps too low. And I'll probably do that. I'm getting a teensy little bit on there, but it should just be a very, very small amount. If you're not getting any when you use the chisel tip there on your tool, you may have spread it a little bit light. Or if you had excess at the end, extra at the end, in your pot that you didn't spread, you're going a little bit light, I would say, because I had just barely enough. It was just the right amount. Don't mix any more than that. It was absolutely perfect. I haven't glued these particular pieces on before. It's the first time I've built this boat, but I have glued things together before with epoxy. A few times. More than a few times, of course. Okay, and get your forward clamp. Don't have it covering right. You need a little visible space there to make sure you're flush. That's down just a little bit. Okay, there. That's up, flush. A little proud, but not much. And this side, I think, is slid down just a teensy bit. Okay. And get the two together and get a paper clamp right on the very front with those two lined up exactly true. Okay. Remember, in the cutout, where the heart-shaped piece is going to sit, in the cutout, the edge rail is going to be a little proud. Well, quite a bit proud because of the heart-shaped piece fitting down in there. Okay. Now let's check first from one side and then from the other side. At the back, where I wanted to make sure those were flush, I found it worked quite well to use one of my old brushes that, if you haven't thrown them all away after they've gotten hard, or something hard, and push up where the veneers overlap, push up and true them right at the bottom edge there, if you can see what I'm doing there. And then you get one more paper clamp towards the back here. Oh, on the second side, I didn't think to do this on the first side, but it's a good idea. On the second side, there's a little bit more overlap. It's pretty close, pretty similar, but there's a little more overlap here on the second side. And I did think on the second side to coat the top surface of my veneer at the very back where it slides underneath the overlap. Okay, and I didn't think to do that on the first side, but I think it's a good idea to do that. Okay, now I'm going to use my little chisel tip tool that I just created from the cutoff of the veneer and do a check on both sides. And there's a little bit squeezing out. It's not hardly enough to be visible, but when I scrape along with my chisel tip, I am getting a little bit of epoxy off. So that's actually good. That means that I don't have a dry joint or a gap in there. You don't really want a gap at all, but you don't want a lot of squeeze out either. Okay, and this is the time to take the epoxy off because it comes off quite easily while it's still liquid before it sets up. I really don't see any squeezing out, but I am getting a little bit on my chisel tool. It's a teensy bead as I slide it along. And then just, you have to every 3 or 4 inches wipe your chisel tool off on a paper towel. I don't know if you can see that or not, it's so little, but there's just a little bit there. Now if this was kind of running and gooping down the sides, this, I could still work on it at this point, but it would not be nearly as easy. And probably the end result might not be quite as satisfactory. And then after this, the trick is just going to be leave it alone. You really cannot do the top layer of veneer until this is set up. And to try to do both at once would be beyond my skill level. Would be pretty tricky. So I would not contemplate that. One side done. Oh, I had a little bit more squeezing out right at the very back there. And this will tell you how evenly you've spread your epoxy. I must have had a little bit more right at the back edge because a little bit more came off on my chisel tool. Now I'm getting a very even amount. I had some of these paper clamps binder clips down a little bit too far for ease of cleaning off. So you might watch that while you're putting it together, not to put your paper clamps down too far. Again, a little bit. And I also have foam on some of these paper clamps, and sometimes that's useful, but actually in this application it's a bit of a nuisance because the foam is down a little bit farther than the paper clamp is. The foam in some situations keeps the paper clamps from skidding on the surface. But in this application there's no angle or anything at the bow. If your paper clamp is skidding on at the bow, you could put a little bit of it's just double adhesive backed insulation foam, 1/8 inch insulation foam that we put on our paper clamps. If you've built the T50 or the T65, you'll remember that. Little teensy gap at the butt joint, but I'm just filling that in with a teensy bit of epoxy here. Doesn't take more than a teensy bit. It is really very tight. Very nice joint. And the bow comes together really nicely. So we're doing great. Well done. Take a look at it though. Don't walk away without checking it. It's all too easy to think, oh, I did that just great, and then you come back and check it the next day after it's all set up and you see something you didn't notice before, and it's like, oh, why didn't you look at it now? If you're going to look at it real carefully, looking for mistakes or places where the alignment's not perfect or something, do that looking right now, and not after it's set up. After it's set up, don't look as carefully. Look most carefully right now. And all the way along, a little teensy bit of squeeze out on the top surface. Let's see if you can see that if we get in close, because that's what you want. Just that teensy bit of squeeze out. Uh-oh. There. Maybe you can see right between the paper clamps, the binder clips, just the hint of some epoxy there, but not enough. It'll just one swipe of the sandpaper, it'll clean that off. Not enough to need to scrape off or anything. Okay, nice job. That's going to set up. Let's go down, look at it from more, zoom out, and look at it more from, well, with all those binder clips, you can't really see how it's going to look, but that's going to look spectacular. That nice trim piece along the edge, and it'll, again, remember it's only half of the trim piece. It'll have another thickness on there, so it'll be a real nice detail. Very clever, very clean, very elegant. Oh, just the last note, you can see obviously that the deck is in place, and I am checking to make sure that as I put that rail on, it's not pulling the sides away from the deck or changing the shape or anything. The deck will keep the sides from pushing in. So this is another step where the laminating this with the deck in place, laminating these strips on with the deck in place, is one more layer of locking the sides into their correct position. So do have the deck in place here, and again have the deck in place when we put on the second set of laminations. I don't think you really need to see me doing the second set. It'll be one large mark of pre-thickened resin, thickened a little bit more with phenolic powder, but you want it to be able to spread smoothly and easily, rather than being sort of clumpy and build it, hard to spread out evenly. You want it to spread out evenly, and you should come out with just the right amount. And again, we'll fit the bow, and to bring the two sides together to a perfect V at the bow, and then we will go back and fit the stern to the Draketail, where the Draketail not cap rail, but outwale comes forwards, so we have a nice clean butt joint there on the outside piece of veneer. So I think you can handle that on your own, since it's a sort of instant replay of what we just did. And so we'll be back when we get on to the step after that second layer of edge trim outwale veneer. And this is a beautiful African mahogany that we're putting on here, and it's going to look gorgeous when it's varnished.